Hello, this is a video that is a summary of the Excel workshop on pivot tables that the Diocese of Joliet recently presented for our parish business managers and parish staff. I am Sharon Hauk. This is the fifth in a series of videos. We also did Excel basics, formulas, tables, and charts. Today's video is about pivot tables. So we're going to take a look at Excel as data, how to create a pivot table, edit a pivot table to analyze data, and create charts based on pivot tables. Let's first do a little review. So I'm looking at some very simple data here. It's fictitious data about some t-shirt sales that I made up. And the first thing that I want to remind everyone about is how to widen columns all at once. So these columns right now are too narrow. You can especially see in this column we've got pound signs as a visual clue that this is too narrow. I'm going to click in the upper left-hand corner. That highlights the entire sheet. And now when I double click between any two column headings, Excel will do an auto fit or a best fit for every column in the spreadsheet. So that's a reminder of how to do that quickly. Then let's remember how to format as a table. So in Excel, formatting as a table gives you a lot of important features. Maybe most importantly, it allows Excel to treat the data as one entity, a block of data for performing pivot tables or charts or things like that. So how to do this? Put your cursor anywhere inside your block of data and then go to the ribbon Format as Table and pick one of these aesthetic choices. This tells us what it thinks our data is. I can tell visually even that it's correct. And I'm going to make sure that I have a check on my table has headers, which means that I have a row at the top of my data, which are the column headings, but also are referred to as fields. So when we get into making a pivot table, these will be called fields. And when you're dealing with data, these are also often called fields. Let's remember how to do some mathematics in Excel or work with formulas. This cost column has nothing in it, but I am going to use it as an example for doing some math. Anytime you're going to work with math in Excel or a formula, a function, start out with an equal symbol. Then, in this case, these are our fictitious t-shirt sales. This company placed an order of 75 large t-shirts at $5.25 each in the store. Okay, so the math that I want for the cost on this order is 75 times, and that's an asterisk in Excel, 525. Press enter. And one of the things I want you to see or remember is that when you're working with a table and you do math in one of the cells, Excel will say, oh, I suspect that they want that all the way down this column, and will automatically do that same calculation for the rest of the column. All right, enough of the review. Now we have some nice data in a table. Let's make something called a pivot table. With my cursor in the table, I'm going to click Insert on the ribbon. And then a pivot table is such a common and important thing. It's actually the first choice on that Insert tab, Pivot Table. And the table that we were working with is already recognized as the source of our data. And I'm just going to leave this as the default, that it will put the pivot table on a new worksheet. So I'm just going to say OK. And now I have a new sheet, and it looks like maybe not much happened, but in fact, this is now set up for me to do some sophisticated analysis on that data. Importantly, off to the right, I have a list of fields. So these were my column headings. And then I have 4 boxes down here. Filters, columns, rows, and values. Let's take these one at a time. The first thing that I'm going to do with this is put something in the rows box. and I am going to put the companies, that field, the company field, in rows. And what that will do is that will create a row for each company. If I had more companies in my data, we would see more here, but there are only 3. So this is kind of a small pivot table. And importantly, rows is what you want down the left-hand side. Now, let's put the purchase method in columns. Columns is what you want across the top of your analysis. So there were 3 different types of purchase methods in this data: in-store or mailer or online purchase. Very good. Now, what do we want in the middle? That's this values. And I will drag cost there. Now, in this moment, the cost doesn't look very impressive because it's not formatted well. Let's right-click on that and say value field settings, which gives us lots of choices on this cost, including the format. So I'm going to say the number format is currency, and now that looks better. Okay, so that was a simple pivot table. We put company in the rows box over here, so that's what's down the left-hand side. We put a different field, in this case purchase method, in columns, so that's what's across the top. And we put cost in values. That's what's in the middle. At its most basic, those are the 3 things that you need to create a pivot table. What do you want down the left? What do you want across the top? And what's in the middle? Now, the other box that we've got here that I didn't use so far is filters. Let's take a look at that. So I'm going to put the size field in the filters box. And you'll notice that didn't change any of the numbers here at all. What changed is that up top, I now have the ability to filter. So I'm going to click here and I'll see choices for size of t-shirts. Let's say I just want to see the numbers for the large t-shirt sales. There they are. Let's change it to just see small. And I could go back to all. So if you want to create a filter that's easy for folks to use, that's what this box is all about. Let's take a look now at creating another pivot table, and this time I want to work a little bit with dates. So this is some more fictitious data, not the t-shirt stuff I had a moment ago, but rather something that involves crime data. I got some of this basic data from an open data portal from the city of Chicago, and then I added a fictitious cost field and changed everything around. So at this point, it's nonsensical. But I wanted a fair amount of data to work with. So this is about 80 rows here. And the first thing I want to do is format this as a table. So format as table. I'll pick one of those colors and say OK. Now, from the point of view of Excel, this data is a table. And now I can insert a pivot table, and it understands very well this block of data. And I'll say OK to put the pivot table on a new worksheet. Same kind of idea that I had a minute ago, sort of a blank slate with my 4 boxes over here that I can put things in. But my fields are the fields related to this particular data, which include things like the primary type of crime that was reported, the description of the location, the cost, the date. All right, let's think about how we want to see this data. I am going to put in the rows the location description. So this is just a list from the data that we have, things that were in those records or rows in terms of the description of the location. Now let's put cost in the values, and I will right click and format this. So value field settings, number format. Let's do currency. All right, that looks better. So, even if what you wanted to do with a pivot table was stop right there and just have what are basically subtotals listed out, that's a perfect way to use a pivot table. You could just stop right there. You wouldn't even need to have anything across the top. But I'm going to go ahead and put something in columns. I'll put the primary type in columns. And in this data, there's only two. Deceptive practice, which is sort of like a cyber crime kind of description, and a regular theft. And we can see that there are a few things here that have something in both of those columns, but a lot of stuff just has a theft-related record. And then, of course, we have grand totals for each of the things and totals for each of the columns, and then a grand total at the bottom. Let's look now, though, at using dates, because that's what I wanted to demonstrate here. There is a date associated with each one of these crime reports, and these are individual dates. So it's interesting to take a look at how Excel might interpret my attempt to summarize when the field that I have is a bunch of individual dates. Let's watch what happens. I'm going to take primary type out of this columns area just by dragging it out of there and say instead across the top, I'd like to look at date. Watch what happens. This is very sophisticated. Excel says, actually, I think that this pivot table is probably intended to summarize, and I will first summarize with years. Notice there's a little plus symbol next to the year. I can click on that and expand to see quarters. This only has data for quarters 1 and 2. That's just because I didn't create any further data. But in normal circumstances, you could expand the year and see quarters 1 through 4. And then, of course, the subtotal per year and the grand total. So very sophisticated behavior of Excel at this point, that I just used the date field and it understood that it would be helpful to summarize by year and then within that by quarter. Let's talk about some other aggregate functions. So I am going to again use this fictitious crime data. I've already turned it into a table. So let's create a new pivot table on this. And this time, let's put the primary type as a row. There's only 2 of them. And within that, the location description. Let's start with that. And we'll put the cost in as the value. So fairly simple pivot table. Let's fix this so that it's currency. I'm going to right click, value field settings, number format, currency. Very good. So I've got some rows that can be expanded or collapsed. That's an interesting thing. Before, I think we just had 1 field in the rows. Now I have 2. And by the way, I want you to notice I could reorder these. So now I'm going to move the location description above. And now this is organized differently so that the first breakout is the location description, and within that is the primary type. Point being that this is up to you. If you have more than one thing you want listed down the left-hand side, not only can you stack up more than one field here, you can also decide the order that it should be in. I'm going to put it back to the previous order. And then what I want to show you with regard to aggregate functions is that right now this says sum of cost, meaning the total of the cost. So this is the total for this area. This is the total for this category. But what if I didn't want to see the total? What if instead I wanted to see the average, for example? That's called an aggregate function. How do I get this to change? Well, if I right click and go back into that area that says value field settings, I can choose one of these other aggregate functions. I can say, you know what, I really just want to see the average cost for each of these categories and say OK. Now that's what I've got. I could also do a maximum or minimum. This one's interesting, count. If I do count, that means how many? How many reports of a crime in the bar or tavern do I have in this data? And if I'm doing a count, I don't want it to be currency, so I'll set that back to a general number and say OK. That's very helpful. This is the count of the different things that were reported. Let's put this back to the sum. So that's a total of the cost, and I'll put it back to currency because I want to show you another thing with this particular tab, this particular sheet. I want to talk about creating a chart. And those of you that have worked with Excel and charts know that sometimes when you try to make a chart from this type of data, you end up with a chart that has way too much detail on it. It's not helpful at all. And you realize that you've got to summarize before making the chart. Well, that's one of the things that the pivot table is doing for you. It is creating a summary. And then based on this, you can make a chart. So let's put the date here just to make this slightly more interesting. And now let's insert a chart. I'll say insert recommended charts. And I'll just say OK to the first thing that pops up here. Now, if I wasn't recording this video, I would have much more real estate and I wouldn't have the chart on top of my pivot table. But just for purposes of you being able to see it, this created not only a nice, simple, easy to understand chart, which was possible because I first made a pivot table, it also automatically put in these wonderful filter drop downs so that I could filter just by a certain year or quarter or description or primary type. And those are built in because of what I did with the pivot table. Let's remove this chart and just go back and see the pivot table. Because of the choices I made with the pivot table over here in these boxes, that drove the types of choices I had on that chart. So again, I just had my cursor in the pivot table. I said insert recommended chart and got something very sophisticated from that process. Okay, now let's take a look at something else. And we've watched the pivot tables group things for us. So it grouped by the company name or grouped by, in this case, a purchase method. This was something in our data. Grouped by year. I want to show you that actually you can even customize how Excel is grouping in the pivot table. So we're back now to the t-shirt data, except I have a whole lot more of it, probably several hundred records of fictitious t-shirt sales data. And I've already created a table out of it, formatted it as a table. So let's insert a pivot table on this data, put it in a new worksheet. And this time, let's put the date down the left-hand side. And let's put the company in the columns, so across the top. And now let's put the cost in the values. Fix this so that it's currency. Okay. And what I want to show you is that uh, just because this is down the left-hand side doesn't mean I still can't expand and get my years expanded to quarters, for example. But what if I didn't actually want this broken out by quarters, and maybe I don't want all of the dates to be shown? Let's take a look at how I can customize how my pivot table is doing the grouping. If I right click on this year, I can go to group, and we can see what it intends right now to group by. It is currently starting at the beginning of my data, going to the end of it. That's what this auto is all about. And it's grouping by years, quarters, and months. Well, perhaps I actually just want to see the first part of 2017. So maybe I type in here 1/1/2017, and then maybe we go to the end of June 2017. So the first half of that year. And I don't want to see years or quarters, I merely want to see months. So this should give me the first half of 2017 broken out by month. And that's what I have right here. So it's up to you if you are okay with the grouping that the pivot table did for you. Very good. But if you want to customize how it's grouping, you can right click on one of the groups, go to group on the shortcut menu, and specify what you want in terms of how it behaves for the grouping. Let's just change that to quarters and see what happens. Okay, very interesting. Let's take a look now, for the fun of it, at I'm going to set this back to auto and where it was before, a chart based on this data. Maybe I don't want all of those to be showing. Let's try this. Insert recommended charts. Very nice. So this is the same kind of thing we did a moment ago when we said if you already have a pivot table, it's summarizing your data very nicely. Create a chart from that, and you have something really spiffy, and also that has these filters already built into the chart so that you could just filter it. In this case, I'll just say I don't want all the companies, I just want Chesterton, etc. Let's put this back to all. All right, let's take a look now at something called a slicer. This is a little pivot table I've already created on some of the t-shirt data. And as we know, we could put something in the filters box over here that would show up top and be a way that people could filter if they were working with this spreadsheet. Also, people can filter on these drop downs right here in the pivot table. Those are already available. Well, that was kind of hard to see there. These have filtering capabilities. If I put something here in this box, it's a filtering capability. But let's look at something called a slicer, which also allows someone to filter, and very easily, even if they're not familiar with Excel, and even if they're not familiar with pivot tables. So with my cursor in the pivot table, I'm going to go up to the ribbon and click on Analyze. This is something that's part of the ribbon when you're working with pivot tables. And now I'm going to say Insert Slicer, and it already knows about the fields that I have. So I'll just say in this case, how about a slicer for the purchase method? Now this can sit on my spreadsheet. I could send this to someone who's not familiar with Excel at all, and they could easily click on the different choices and see the values that were associated with that filtering. Let's do another one. I'm going to put my cursor back in the pivot table and say Analyze, Insert Slicer, and then I think I'll also do date, the order date. Now I've got this in months. I think let's delete that one. Let's go back to the slicer and do years. That's probably more helpful. That years showed up because I had the date at one point in the pivot table, and it knew that maybe I'd want to summarize by that. Oh, right, I have it in the pivot table already. So let's just say I only want to see 2017 online totals. Okay, so this slicer idea is helpful, especially if someone is not that familiar with Excel. They can easily choose the data that they're interested in. Let's now take a look at another way of using charts with pivot tables. So I have this same t-shirt data again, but this time, instead of making a pivot table and then making a chart from the pivot table, I'm going to kind of do those two processes in one step. So this time, I'm going to click Insert, but I'm not going to say Pivot Table or Recommended Charts. This time, I'm going to click Pivot Chart. Think of it kind of as a twofer because it's going to allow me to create a chart at the same time that it is creating the underlying pivot table. So in this case, I think I'm going to put purchase method. So that was like the online or the in-store kind of stuff in the box here, which by the way, you'll notice instead of saying rows, it says axes, I should say it that way. The cost will still be the values, and I'm going to set that as currency. And then here, this doesn't say columns, it says legend, but it functions in a similar way. So I think I'll put order date there. Oh, it's warning me. There's a maximum number that it could put in there, so it's going to summarize it for me with years and quarters. That's super. So point being with this, when I said insert pivot chart, in one step, Excel made the pivot table for me and the chart at the same time. And the chart has the filtering available that I specified off to the right. Lastly, I would just like to point out that to find more information on Excel or any of the Office products, the best place to start, I think, is support.office.com. That's Microsoft's own learning portal, and it's got wonderful tutorials and articles associated with any of the Office products. Thank you for watching this video.